Alright, so this video is over section 2, chapter 13. It's on biotic and abiotic factors. Before we get started though, you probably just finished another video and some of you might be a little freaked out. I forgot to give you a word for one of your blanks. I didn't realize I skipped over it. But for your biome definition, right, it's defined by climate conditions and major types of plant life. Forgot to uncover that climate part of the definition. Just kind of assumed it was there, forgot it was there. So you can get that filled in now. Otherwise, we do need to get this next section started. Your objectives are to identify biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem. Now, based off of prior knowledge, I would assume you know what bio means. And if you remember that biology is the study of living things, biotic factors are probably living factors. And then if I throw an A in front of anything, right, that little prefix just tells you basically the opposite of. So the opposite of a living thing would be a non-living thing. So we're going to talk about living factors and non-living factors in an ecosystem. But then we're also going to describe how a change in one factor of an ecosystem can affect others. Okay, so again, you guys already know these definitions, but you should probably get them into your notes either way. Biotic is living versus abiotic, which would be non-living. Right, there are a few whiteboard questions in this section, but we're going to go ahead and cover those in class tomorrow. So you can think about this question, right? Some factors in an ecosystem are unseen, so you'd have to think about some of those factors that you can't see, although they're still there. But we'll cover that later. If you want to try and come up with an answer so you have a head start later, that's fine. But otherwise, the other part of this section, another thing in here, we need to talk about biodiversity. And that would be the variety of living things in an ecosystem. And there's a note here that says that biodiversity generally increases as you move towards the equator. Right, so you're saying you have lots of different kinds of living things. And we're trying to understand how that can be beneficial for an ecosystem. Right? When you have lots of different living things interacting with each other, usually that's good because they depend on each other in lots of different ways, right? From our perspective, we like biodiversity because it gives us lots of things to eat, right? But because organisms depend on each other in a lot of different ways, not just predator-prey relationships, right? There can be a lot of benefits, but just as a generic one, that one would work pretty well. Again, a whiteboard question right here. We might cover that tomorrow. As long as you're paying attention, though. I think you already figured that out. And then it also talks about keystone species. And a keystone species is any keystone species that has an unusually large effect on its ecosystem. It does say generally positive there because usually that's what we're referring to when we're talking about a keystone species. Talking about one that if you removed it, it would be devastating to its ecosystem. Whereas some keystone species have negative effects on their ecosystems, and since they do have a major effect, it still counts as being a keystone species. It's just usually we talk about this in a positive context. So there's two different routes that you can go here. Usually that keystone species would be a major food source. So for us, in our ecosystem that we live in, our neck of the woods in Nebraska, right, we live in a grassland. So that keystone species is pretty obvious, it's grass. Right? Without the grass, we couldn't feed the cows. Without the cows, right, a lot of us couldn't make a living. So it's pretty important to us as a whole. So that keystone species in our area is that grass. But sometimes it's not a major food source. Sometimes, excuse me here, can't seem to grab the box. There we go. You have something like a beaver. they can manage to provide habitat for a multitude of species by building an environment, building an ecosystem all by itself. Right? The beaver took down a couple trees, built a dam. Now there's a lake there where there wasn't a lake before. You have habitat for lots of different things then all of a sudden. Right? You got a place for fish, for birds, for all sorts of different organisms to thrive in that wouldn't have been there without the beaver itself. So a beaver could be considered a keystone species in that, from that standpoint. And we have one last whiteboard question here, because we can talk about humans as being a keystone species. And you could use a lot of different examples here. I would tell you that when we do this, there is no wrong answer really, as long as you support your answer. Because sometimes we do actually have a positive effect on our environment, and you could explain that in your example, and you can make it sound like that we're a keystone species in that case. You can talk about how we have a huge negative impact on our environment, and that's another way that we could be a keystone species. So, generally speaking, the answer is probably going to be yes, but the example that you use basically tells us, do we have a positive effect or a negative effect? So it doesn't really matter what your example is, which direction you lean, but considering either way, we're probably going to have a huge effect on that environment, might still be considered a keystone species. So yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow.